Okay. All right, so we're recording. I knew that Summer was maybe going to be arriving a couple of minutes late because she's going to the library to have some sort of space on her own to do this. And Erica is joining us. I sent out a little email to a few people that I knew that I wanted to just invite to maybe be part of this conversation. But really, originally, the idea was for the 4 featured writers and me to sort of have a conversation. And if we did this live at the conference, we would have people live with us. But because we're doing the pre-recording, we were sort of going to be missing that component. However, a couple of people might be joining us and they can kind of just listen in and be part of it. And then later, those who are in the conference will join in a listening capacity. But I'm going to just get started at this point because we want to make sure we try to stay in our 90-minute slot. So hello, and I'm speaking to those who are going to be watching us later, not just to you as featured writers. And hello and welcome to Building a Mad Archive, Informing, Reforming, and Transforming Mental Health Care Law and Policy Through Literacy. This reading and our discussion is part of the Coalition for Community Writing's annual conference on community writing, and our session is being pre-recorded. We decided to make this session pre-recorded because it would allow for more easier access to the session for our featured readers, meaning we could all meet at a certain time that would be more convenient for us, and because it would allow for us to have a longer and therefore I hope more meaningful discussion. All of you who were invited to be part of, and I'm going to be getting people coming in as this is happening. Maybe I can make one of you co-hosts to let people in the room. I might do that with a couple of you. Yes. How many co-hosts can I have? Because we're going to be getting people coming in and I'm going to try to keep reading. Okay. All right. So the session is being recorded. It will be published and made public with closed captioning and with an access copy of the core materials. So your attendance, and we were given sort of advance notice of this, and your attendance is a form of consent, but I just want to remind you of this while we're getting started in case anyone has forgotten or did not note it. Others will be welcomed into the intimate space of this reading and discussion when it becomes a public space at the October conference. That being said, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Jessica Lowell Mason. I use she, her pronouns mostly, although I'm also open to playing with pronouns and gender identity expression. And the image that is projected of me today is the head and shoulders of a white woman with choppy, short gingerbread hair, green eyes, and a long, thin nose with books and art in the background. I am grateful to be part of this session and to serve as facilitator of today's reading and discussion of the Mad Archive. I want also to express my gratitude to each person we invited to be in attendance today for being here with us, to the featured writers who today will be our featured readers and discussion leaders, and who will be sharing their hearts, their work, their ideas, and to those of you who will view and participate in your own way later. I would like to begin by making a couple of important acknowledgements. The first is a land acknowledgement, and even though we're meeting virtually, we're also inhabiting physical locations, and I would like to acknowledge that I am currently connecting from the traditional territory of the Seneca Nation of the Haudenosaunee Six Nations Confederacy. And as an extension of this acknowledgement, I would like to acknowledge the multiple and interconnected legacies of violence that continue to affect how we think, work, and approach projects in the United States today. Would anyone else like to introduce yourself and acknowledge the traditional lands that you're on at this time?
I'm Anna, and I'm coming to you from Halifax, which is also used to be known as Jabuktuk, and it's in Mi'kmaq, the land of the Mi'kmaq people.
Thank you. Yeah, Bonnie.
I'm Bonnie Shell, and I was raised in Atlanta, Georgia. I now live in North Carolina, which is the land of the East Band of the Cherokees, who went into the mountains and escaped having to walk to Oklahoma. And I spent most of my life in California, where I was considered a redneck because of my accent. but I'm back in the South where people can understand what I say.
Thank you,
I'm
Bonnie.
glad to be here.
Thanks for being here, Bonnie.
And I'm Nicole Cravar. I'm joining you all from Tucson, Arizona. So I'm currently on Tohono O'odham Nation and Pasqua Yaqui tribe land.
Thank you. Betty.
Yeah, I'm with Bonnie in Asheville, but I grew up in Massachusetts, land of the Merrimacks.
Thank you. Any others? Yeah, there you go, Summer.
My name is Summer Javadi, and I'm in the Kansas City metropolitan area. And this is originally Native American lands that surround the Hopewell, and they were joined by the Kansa as well as the Osage Native American populations.
Thank you. Thank you all. Following the example of my colleague Janelle, who couldn't be here today, but who co-facilitates a Herstory Writers Network workshop titled Memoirs to Reimagine Mental Health Care with me on Thursday nights or Thursday afternoons, I want to also acknowledge the ways in which the mental health care and psychiatric system has been used as a colonizing tool and a tool of white supremacy, as an arm of genocidal violence against Indigenous peoples, and as an arm of slavery. The system has been used as a tool of many kinds of oppression, including patriarchal oppression, homophobic oppression, and transphobic oppression. And it is important we start with this acknowledgement because the need to build a MAD archive or MAD archives, it comes out of and is shaped by this legacy of how intersecting systems of oppression have been carried out through and by psychiatry. We will not necessarily be reimagining mental health care during this gathering, but we will be doing something deeply connected with that. We will be imagining ways of making MAD archives and of utilizing MAD archiving and MAD archives to fight against oppression and to affect oppressive policies and laws that continue to perpetuate and carry out legacies of violence against those who are its targets. So although I've scripted the beginning of this gathering, I want you to know that I do plan to be more fully unscripted and vulnerable for the rest of the time after I sort of finish the intro and we have our readings. I have found in leading our Herstory workshop each week that just being present and together is enough, and it works best for genuine collaboration. It makes these occasions and spaces meaningful. We are not here today to share academic papers or to find ways to publish our work or advance our theories. We are gathering to think about the ways that community writing can and does affect needed social change around psychiatric oppression, to share our words, our hearts, our minds, gathered in the service of solving social problems to which our community writing projects and our personal wisdom provide potential solutions. In this instance, we are gathering to think about a MAD archive, what it has been, what it is, why it is needed, what it does, what it has the potential to do, how we can continue to develop it and keep growing it, and how it might affect greater changes that we hope to see in our system of care. The idea for this reading and discussion came out of the work of Madwomen in the Attic, the feminist mental health and madness literacy organization that my sister, Melissa Bennett, and I started in 2017. When we started the organization, we did not have a clear idea in mind of what the organization could do or would become, but we sensed our way forward. We sensed that such an organization in our community of Buffalo, New York was needed. We sensed this together through what we experienced during my traumatic hospitalization that year. The organization's mission started to form out of the shared pain that we felt and the outrage we felt over what I went through at a facility that was supposedly designed for care, but that in reality delivered agony and carcerality for me. We started the organization as a response to the suffering I experienced, but also to the suffering to which we were witness and others when I was an insider in the system. We wanted to identify ourselves as two people in a great big world of people who had witnessed something unjust but hard to name, so that others who might feel isolated or alienated or agonized by their own experiences could find us and come together with us to do something we knew not what at first. So we don't have time today for me to give you the entire history of the organization, so far in its existence, or for me to talk about each of the projects that we have started. But if you are interested, you can learn more on our website at www.madintheattic.org. There are also interviews with my sister and me that are available online that detail some of our experiences and some of the projects we have done. I want to make sure we have ample time for our featured writers to share and reflect on their work and for us to discuss the Mad Archive. So I'm going to focus on our first literacy project, which has been the most enduring, I would say, palpable, and the easiest project for us to do no matter the circumstances, and which I believe constitutes an example of a Mad Archive, however imperfect and in need of development it is in its current manifestation. We did not set out to create a Mad Archive when we created the Feature Writer Project. We knew we wanted to do something with reading and writing that related to empowering and supporting women and gender nonconforming people who had been affected in any way by the mental health care and psychiatric system, especially those who had been harmed. At our first gathering, Hannah was there, we talked about our ideas, and in gathering ideas with the group, we went forward with an idea to create a website and to make our first project a writing project in which we would publish work by writers who were part of our organization or who wanted to support it and be part of the organization and its mission in some way. The project was not closely tied, or the project was not just closely tied to the mission, it came out of the mission. At the heart of this was the desire to create space of discourse about madness and about mental health outside of the mental health care system. The idea that we could make a space for writers to assert, name, and claim their identities, truths, and perspectives, and hold space for their writings and art seemed to function in opposition to a system which assumes a position of universal authority, accepts its forms of knowledge as being the only forms of knowledge, and often practices that authority in coercive and violent ways on bodies. The idea seemed to resist psychiatric knowledge in favor of the knowledge of women and gender nonconforming people who had experienced the system as objects of contestation within it. It pushed back against being psychiatrized and placed in a system that claims authority over identity and body, a system that processes people through oppressive labels, that tells people who they are and who they can and cannot be and become, a system that takes in bodies and evaluates them and their worth, and that judges their worthiness of being accepted into the world before casting them back out into the world to carry the load of having been processed, of having been evaluated and labeled, of having been in a carceral environment, of having been forced to conform or force medicated. It was obvious that we could not be heard within a psychiatric system whose authority and forms of knowledge relied on the premise that those within it must not be considered capable of either. Many others, those within the Mad Pride movement especially, have been doing the work of challenging psychiatric power through writing and activism, and MIDA's Featured Writer Project is both an extension of that work and of the needs of those who gathered and wanted to be part of Madwomen in the Attic during its first year. It was intuitive that we needed a space and that we wanted and needed to be heard. The Featured Writer Project was part of that space and part of the ever-evolving struggle for our voices to be heard in order to effect change within the carceral mental health care system. The project was also a way we found in time of community forming. The writers who write for the project are aligning in solidarity with MIDA's mission and are forming a community of writers who agree that it is important for their voices to be heard and who have something important to say to others who have experiences within different parts of the same larger system and who want to be part of a project that carries out MIDA's mission to connect women and gender nonconforming people from attic to attic. The project itself is a literary resource, and it is a form of community wisdom on the subjects of madness and mental health, built by people who have had experiences within a society that stigmatizes and fears people who are mad, or who experience emotional distress and who are labeled mentally ill, a system that does not want to face its history or its present day realities, or the pain it has caused and continues to cause those who are under its care or its authority. Originally, the project was meant to be part of how we would constitute our monthly meetings. I did not like the idea of having a meeting without some kind of basic structure, as Hannah knows. Ours would consist of 3 components. Support and fellowship is the first, literacy is the second, and advocacy work, our projects that we're carrying out, is the third. The project was made for the live meetings we were going to hold each month. It was part of, not separate from our meetings. We came up with the idea of Mad Mondays, Mondays on which we would hold our monthly meetings, and we would publish a featured writer on that Mad Monday each month that we were holding our meetings. And then a segment of our meeting would be devoted to reading and discussing the work of the featured writer. We wanted our featured writers to know that their work is going to be read aloud, is going to be read by a community and discussed. It was really important. That was a big part of the project, however small that community was going to be. And we wanted them to know that their work would be discussed and that it would matter and that we would be their readers. That was and is an important component of the project, although the pandemic has sort of put that reading aloud at meetings practice on hold temporarily. We were not sure that the project would take off or attract readers the first year, since our organization is neither for-profit nor not for profit. In other words, we have no money and we operate only using the labor of our bodies. And so calls for submission today often require that publishing entities pay for calls to go out, and we don't have that. We don't have funding for that. So my sister, Melissa Bennett, was our first featured writer, and she wrote a poem titled The Comfort Room. And I might share my screen now just to give you a little view of it. I think I can do this. So what I'm sharing now is an image. This is drawn from The Color Purple, adapted from The Color Purple, and it says Melissa Bennett, my sister's name on it. Below is her poem, The Comfort Room, which I will just read right now. I sat in an old ratty recliner in the comfort room, with supervision, of course, someone to judge my every facial expression. A bout of laughter or a single tear. I sat in the chair staring at bare concrete walls and a mural of a beach. Oh, the irony. Here is your view of what exists on the outside. Your only view through windowless walls. A place you can go once you pop your pills and your delusional brain is cured. Screw the weight gain, the facial tics, and how you got here. Your brain will fit in. When I am on the outside, I will go to that beach, dig my toes in the hot sand, leisurely sip a pina colada, watch an orange sun set over crashing waves. I will get out and find a new job. They don't like delusional teachers. Screw my passion, screw my degree of mastery, my intellect, my pride. I will get out and find a place to live. Screw the family and friends who wouldn't visit or accept my desperate phone calls, the slumlord who won't accept welfare. I will go to that beach, but first I will repossess my car from the possessors. I will go there once I peel off this wet, sticky, bulky, dense coat of shame. I have an outburst, laughter, tears, my head thrusts back, and the old ratty recliner screeches. Now that is irony. Okay, time's up. The Comfort Room. So I actually haven't read that poem since we published it in 2017. It's emotional for me to read it. And this is probably my sister's first and only poem she's ever written. She's not a person who identifies as a writer or a poet since maybe middle school, I would think. She wanted to write for the project in order to help it get on its feet and to help the organization get on its feet. And she also wrote it for me out of her love for me. And if you note, I don't know if this came up when you were reading it, but the poem is supposed to be written through my eyes, but it's in her voice. So I'm gonna stop sharing now for a second here. Okay, we're back in the group. So during our first year, most of the featured writers were local and part of the local chapter of MIDA. But after the first 4 featured writers, which completed our first year as an organization since we started in April, Lambda Literary started putting out our call for submissions on its site, and we attracted a great deal of attention and interest for the project through that. Many of our featured writers are part of the LGBTQ community. And this is a phenomenon that is not simply due to the fact that our call for submissions is promoted by Lambda Literary or the fact that I, one of the co-founders, am a lesbian. There is a long and disproportionate history of the psychiatrization of the psychiatric oppression against the LGBT community in the United States. Added to this is the fact that LGBTQ people are often alienated from their communities and harmed by them, making them more likely to suffer emotional distress or other forms of socially shaped suffering. Every year so far, it has been enough for us to share our call for submissions on our site with our members and with Lambda Literary. And the months have filled up with featured writers, with writers who want to be part of Madwomen in the Attic and doing what we're doing and what the project is doing. The Featured Writer Project invites women and gender nonconforming people to be featured writers. There is no gatekeeping involved, as would be involved in a literary journal. If someone wants to be a featured writer and can support, send us their materials and they support the mission and are part of the mission, they can be one, and we will show them support and make it work and help them. The project consists of 3 components: the writing of the art or the poetry, what they wish to submit, an essay. We'll see some various types with our featured writers today. And then a note from a statement from the writer or a note from the writer. And this is a sort of place for the writer to say, to contextualize their work, to say what they want to say about themselves and their work and about how they define or don't define terms around madness and mental health, what terms they use, what they don't want to use, what their feelings are about it. That's a space of the note from the writer, and then a photographic representation of the writer and a biography. The project is about representation. It's about self-representation and self-fashioning, and it seeks to support a sense of authority over self or autonomy to those who are part of the project. Madwomen in the Attic is there to provide or hold space or to house the work, as well as to bring together writers. And over time, I have come to think of this project as having formed and as forming ongoingly an archive. Through the Featured Writer Project, we are building a Mad archive. I am not an archivist, by training and at this point in my life, although this work has sort of made me want to do that kind of work, but I'm not a librarian. I don't work within the archives regularly. So I am seeking with this session and the community wisdom that all of you bring and support for the project of building a Mad archive, not just in terms of the Featured Writer Project, but what else can we do? What other kinds of projects can we do? And I want to just sort of think through the archive, think through how we can sustain this. Is it, if I die and I can't pay for my website anymore, what happens to all of the writing? Where can we have physical copies located? How do we connect with places? How do you get an archive to exist in a library or another kind of space that's going to be long lasting? Because I think that is something that we need. So the Featured Writer Project is a Mad archive that built itself somewhat deliberately and somewhat inadvertently. And I hope for us to think through together what it means and how it might be developed. So this leads me out of the introduction of the Mad archive and into the introduction of 4 of MIDA's either past or future featured writers. I am incredibly grateful to gather with you today and to see and hear and feel in my heart your words and your work. And I am excited for others to learn about you and about your work and about the Featured Writer Project through you. I'm going to do these introductions first, and then we'll go to each person. Our 4 featured writers are A. Summer Javadi, Hannah A2, and we have Anna Kwan joining us, who is a future featured writer, and Nicole Cravar. I'm going to start with some biographies here. Summer Javadi is an Afro-Asian author, poet, and anthropologist of Allen College. Her studies emphasize Afro-Asian cultural and religious pluralism, as well as advocate within the Native American Boarding School Initiative with the Department of Interior, initiated by U.S. Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland. Summer's most recent works surround subjects of indigenous cultures of Asian countries, and Summer awaits publishing her children's book, Under the Cherry Blossom Tree, co-authored with her husband. Summer is the mother of 7 children and works in mental health advocacy and community writing projects that promote Mad Pride and inclusion of marginalized people. She published Zen Tao Gi, DNA Untangled recently. Summer joined Madwomen in the Attic in 2019 and began serving as a regional literacy director. She was one of MIDA's featured writers in 2020, the same year that she was chosen as a writer for Kansas City's Black Writers Black Sunflowers Wildflower Project. Summer has several radio interviews, where she continues open dialogue on mental health advocacy and suicide prevention. Hannah A2 is a regional literacy director for Madwomen in the Attic, a former editorial associate and permissions editor for Prometheus Books, and an aspiring memoirist. She has a bachelor's degree in English, creative writing, and German from Canisius College, and she is currently writing a memoir on her and her family's experiences with mental illness. Anna Kwan is a Halifax poet and novelist. She likes to create paintings and short animated films of her original poetry. Middle-aged, mixed race, and mad, Anna is also a Baha'i, a writing workshop facilitator, a current board member of the Writers Federation of Nova Scotia, and this year a juror for the brand new Maxine Tynes Nova Scotia Poetry Book Prize. Anna has published 2 novels with Invisible Publishing and is currently working on a 3rd, and her professionally published poetry chapbook, Body Parts, was released by Gaspereau Press in 2021. And last but not least, Nicole Cravar is a doctoral candidate of English literature at the University of Arizona. Her research interests include contemporary American literature, Madwomen and Mad Studies, trauma theory, and neoliberalism. She serves as the graduate co-director of Wildcat Writers, a college pathway community engagement program that partners with Title I high school students with college writing students. So with these introductions, I propose that we move into the reading portion today. After the reading and reflections from our featured writers, we will come together to discuss the Mad Archive together, and its potentialities with whatever time we have left. And I have sort of a list of questions that can guide us through that discussion. So I'm just gonna go in the order that I started with the bios. So if Summer, if you could begin with us, that would be wonderful. And you're all welcome to do screen share with us as well. And if you do screen share and you want to show your work on the Madwomen in the Attic page, just try to give a little bit of an image description for our access needs of what we're looking at before you read. If there's a picture of you or something like that that you're showing, describe it. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. And are we going to just go into the readers portion, or do I do the preface of the terms of madness?
I think if you want to just start by sort of saying why you got involved, why you want to be part of the project and that kind of thing, it would be really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, the American Heritage Dictionary of the English Language in its 5th edition defines madness as a state of being mad. Mad in the same respect is considered angry, resentful, mentally deranged, and characteristic of mental derangement. And I tend to agree with the American Standardized definition. However, I embrace that madness as it relates to my work of exposing the feelings and responses of being subjected to a system that requires our soul or our quantitative and qualitative breadth of experience. My work approaches perspective angles of exposing the detriments of labeling injustices of various marginalized people, whether it be minorities, women, or the disabled in a physical or mental capacity, of which I am placed within all these various connotations. My work in life is to expose, to brighten, and to engage in dialogues that surround the allowance of light, to breathe over the depths of disparity of holes that develop within us, any of us who respond in mad capacities. When feelings overwhelm our psyche and our spirit and spill out into our strong etchings that render with pen or vocal arrangements. This archive, and for this quintessential aspect, I felt it a necessity for myself to be a part of and communicate within that tool that MIDA provides me and others. And that is why I'll rise and do this 1,000 times over, as I wrote in my 2010 poem that was featured with MIDA in July 2020. And just a little quote from that was Tainted White, a poem that ends with scream past injustice with fingers and doubled palm, stop that violent silence. The first featured poem that I shared is Amongst the Wildflowers. I grew up amongst the wildflowers, where honeysuckle nights blew the colored winds through the fanfared window. I was conditioned to sweat, pouring beneath the sun-soaked heat that blinded my childhood fears. Yet salt tears stung my lenses. Asphalt and knee scrapes were my sanctuary, where my rubber tires screeched independent innocence. Fear peeked its gaze at us as we played benign in the streets, unknowing that not everyone grows old, unknowing that the one day the wildflowers we adorned would accompany one of our graves without a full head hair of gray. We would solemnly swear our allegiance to a faith, deny the truths of pure grace that echoes our enemies' creeds and myths that allow silence of full-blown skies. We imparted indifference to supplement the dignity we felt we gained from the pool of muddled bigotry. Don't take offense, but to deny us the blood that courses our veins, places plastic bags over our faces, suffocating our nostrils as our eyes bug out, as distinguished groans escape our maligned lips. Like bastard children, hidden in the closet of America's whoredom, this is where us wildflowers bloom. Tainted white, chained like dogs of sleep, they put us down, shot to ass like stubborn mules. We scream for the dignity of our own voices, not subtle air, left to suffocate. Pillows in hand, they creep above us, huge pillows, stuffed pillows. Those pills, no. Cram stuff filled poisons that put us to sleep. Shrouded in gold, they sneak, passing our lips, once red blush cheeked, now snow frost great white. Laws of man are stricken veins to their amuse our fright. An ankle bracelet rebellion, as 7 men restrain a now bridled horse. Muted upon glossed floors, drugged down by force, down tainted white corridor. Sickening air, sickening sight. Twist and contort her arms of flight, torn, shorn hair. They resort by force, bruising the innocent. Cramped legs beneath the control of the man's trampling souls. Trampling souls. Tramps with sold out souls, we struggle against that known power. As humanity is ripped to shreds from bouts with insanity, humanity's profanity steeped with blood oozed wounds, those harrowing punctures to skin, imposed with purposeful intent. They call it booty juice. Scream past injustice with fingers on doubled palm. Stop that violent silence. And just moving on ahead, the cotton monster. Buxom beauty, bucks and booty, swaggering plague on docks they shored, tips of toes dangle near dirt-ridden floors, swaying in stubborn breeze. The maggots, they feed on them kind. Kindred spirits aflame, crosses blazing, no shame, except hell and brimstone fiery pits, fit for their own wit, yet subtle amassed fame, submitting to games, antebellum feats, no more regal discreet, romanticized in callow green, no more a southern love scene, only murder minds. Oh, the graves that Dixie lined, just sweat and blood of those whose skin absorbed the very light they confess. What a useless muddled mess. An empire built on pierced flesh, the confusion of salvation with bondage. To the very breath of him cut short, to escape such prison of mire and frost. He is the one who won, the cotton monster lost. Saltine wafers. We left off the shore at noon, pressed together between pages like dried violet moors. The juicy drip drops of olives, green though they were, smashed against shortened glass, smelled of a Greek summer. They took our serious glances as allegory, pumping panic into our mothers' graves like a formaldehyde chase. They scantily clothed themselves with freedom, tradition folding their game, bottle bleached, just the same. I'm sorry about those whistling winters, cut through veins like razor blade kisses, their violet twilight painted strokes upon trees with suffering shadow in effect. I'm not comfortable with Jesus. He took my last Miracle Whip sandwich and refuses to share. So I decided to stop my Sunday brunches with him, and I gave him back the saltine wafer while I moved on to my vegan phase. And do we have any more time? Okay, Serpent Sands. Bloody Mary flashed her grin in the dim lit bedlam mirror, a specular reflection that revealed her lover's curled hairs. They call it a wastebasket. Squat for the camera. Agoraphobia was never my main course. Falling shadows housed my piddle. I wouldn't be the one cleaning up after it, after all. They dressed in white would tend to it before the lion left his cage. I moved the bare mattress, thin blue and white, stained from the springs of a bed unfit for princess and her pea. Onto the floor, glossed, yet the mint green cannot be cleaned from my fevered mind. Pulling it closer to the brown door near the exit sign was where I heard the slithering sounds of a serpent on khaki-colored sands above me, growing louder with each hissing crawl. Kevorkian left his notepad on my side table. Waiting for the go-ahead signal, I opted to tell the others that they were dead. And heap of hues. I helped pluck the pictures from the wall. They had hung like a schizophrenic haze, canopying the brilliance of a time when the flying Amari swooped heaps of hues upon our heads. But now I ache deep, pulling each nail from them from the wall. I envisioned hanging myself from his clear shower curtain rod because the scent of his departure left my body writhing in sheer madness. He had kept me from the booby hatch, taught me the inner workings of a notion and sage work. He had taught me that jealousy, she had a name. She moved with ease from east to west, transversing satellite waves to find myself stricken with blue shades from the dried cap still metabolizing in my brain. I was smitten, and even Alice leapt to her grave. When he left that summer day, I knew another Wednesday grief, another June heat sadness, mandrake root had backfired that day. And finally, as a mental health advocate and peer support specialist, I have had my fair share overcoming adversities over the years. I have worked as a regional coordinator for Poetry for Personal Power, which allowed me to identify my strengths in conveying anxiety, pain, and struggle within mental health wellness by setting up poetry events, writing workshops to develop the use of art, music, writing, and poetry as a means to overcome difficulties. I'm a survivor of domestic violence, and poetry and writing has taught me how to cope, giving me an innate sense of empathy and understanding to help others. I'm able to pour anxiety and apprehension into my every work and my every word. It has been over 10 years since I was first hospitalized in a mental health facility as I grasped for footing outside the darkness of my own mind and past experience that etched abysmal renderings that I learned to distinct myself from. I learned how to be my own advocate while advocating for suicide prevention and stigma education in diverse populations, both in adult and adolescent realms. One of the poems that is shared in this featured writing series is Tainted White. It comes from the experience with psychiatric drug use and having adverse allergic reactions to them that nearly cost me my life. My struggle with associative identity and being a multiracial woman has caused a great deal of my art to delve into exposing the realities of hatred and the racism within the US's condition. It has caused much political angst for myself, and I hope to continue showcasing this work through mental health advocacy, suicide prevention, while continuing to add to poetry collections that are driven by this format.
Thank you so much, Summer. I think that Summer's work is beautiful and really thought-provoking. And when we have time to sort of have our discussion, I think one of the things we can think about is the way, and Summer's work is a really great example of that, how poetry can be a place is really important to the archive and sort of what it does to push back against narratives. And a lot of that is like, we're discouraged from sort of reading poems in a very, like, to connecting poets with their poems. And I discourage that too with my own work. I don't want someone diagnosing my poetry or diagnosing me based on my poetry. But there are political aspirations, there are political messages in our poems where we chronicle suffering, we chronicle injustice, those are really important. And they might not be literal translations to our lives as a history of our lives, but they can be part of a history, a larger history, a systems history, and they need to be part of those conversations. So thank you so much, Summer. We're just going to go right in the order of the intros that I had given earlier. So Hannah, you'll be next.
Okay, so yeah, I'm Hannah. I'm the regional literacy director for Madwomen, one of the regional literacy directors for Madwomen in the Attic. To give some context to my piece, as it is quite long and I have cut some of it down for time, so we have more time for discussion. I wrote this piece in August of 2018, and I had a major depressive episode in the beginning of 2017, around the time that I joined Madwomen in the Attic. And in December of 2018, my brother died by suicide. So this piece was written before that happened. So essentially my perspectives on mental health when I wrote this were very different from how they are now. So this piece largely focuses on my own personal journey. It focuses on more of a quite literal view on bodily autonomy and madness in a very physical sense. But those who have heard some of my other writing will notice that it is absent of any discussions of my brother. So I wanted to give some context to that, and I can speak more on that later, as I have different goals for reshaping the system than I did when I wrote this piece. So this piece is called Fighting Back: What Krav Maga Changed About My Recovery from Depression. When you sign up for Krav Maga, or any form of martial arts for that matter, you have to be ready to get hit in the face. If you're anything like me, this will happen far more often than your pride would like to allow. In training exercises, when everything is done at a slower pace, you may dodge or counter nearly every carefully placed punch by your patient partner. But when you spar a real opponent, you're never going to truly learn how to fight back until you become tired of getting hit one too many times. This is true of Krav as it is true of life. For me, this happened in early 2017 when a major depressive episode hit me like a blow to the gut. Hardships in my personal life sent years of underlying depression and anxiety devastating my entire body, leaving me limp, unmotivated, and paralyzed by a future I hadn't prepared for. Sure, I was 23 with a great job, a beautiful apartment, and a family and friends who loved me. I'm white, straight, cisgender. You have your whole life ahead of you, everyone kept telling me. Sure, I kept wanting to say, tell that to my depression. For about a year prior to my major depressive episode, I'd been training in a beginner's level all-women self-defense class. I originally chose to do this to build my self-confidence, to make me feel more comfortable living alone, and also because I'd been a victim of stalking in a previous workplace. After realizing my episode, I spent a few more months in the women's class before deciding to sign up for additional fitness classes like traditional boxing and kickboxing. I quickly tapped into a resource I couldn't find anywhere else. The strength training, conditioning, and practice allowed me to concentrate on a part of me I'd never considered before. By punching a cage bag with all the power left in my body, I became closer with my physical self. I felt a separation from the chaos in my mind, or as I like to call it, I began practicing an aggressive meditation. I easily prefer this over traditional meditation, which always feels like an invitation for dwelling on obsessive thoughts. I spend the entire time thinking about what I need to do later, or how I could have said something differently that day, or how anxious I am for something going on the next day. Aggressive meditation has allowed me to leave the rest of my day at the door, clearing my head as long as I'm moving, punching, and challenging my body to see how far I can go and how much stronger I can be. It's heartening when I leave class and realize I just spent 30 minutes, an hour, or even 2 hours not thinking about what was hurting me emotionally that day. Nothing else, other than a dreamless sleep, could fully do that on my worst days. After much encouragement from coaches and fellow classmates, I decided to advance to the Krav Maga belt program to further develop my self-defense training. If you're unfamiliar, Krav Maga is the official self-defense system of the Israeli Defense Forces, originally developed for the IDF and US law enforcement agencies. The fighting style combines aspects of boxing, kickboxing, MMA, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, karate, and various other forms of martial arts. It's a no-nonsense, pure survival kind of defense, intended to be accessible for all people of all ages and body types. Learning how to defend yourself returns to you ownership of your body, a sense of ownership that as a woman, as a person with mental health issues, or as both, you often can lose. Depression and anxiety loosen feelings of self-doubt, insecurity, shame, and embarrassment for the person you think you are. It takes away your power to choose, your power to know what you want and to carry that out. Further, as a woman, you are constantly threatened into feeling like you don't quite own your own body, like you need to get out of the way, take up less space, but also like you're up for examination at any time. It's refreshing and perhaps cleansing to connect with your physical self, particularly when you're going through a dark time. When I'm in Krav, I'm not thinking about anything but the technique, the strikes, I'm working on all of the little details that make a big difference in keeping myself unharmed while doing the maximum amount of damage to my attacker. There's no time for daydreaming and drills when you're pounding strikes on the pad, maybe getting pushed around on different sides to keep you grounded and focused, and getting safely, spontaneously drilled on defenses by other classmates. All you can do is focus on the sequence of moves and strikes, getting control of your attacker, and getting out of the situation. In my past, I've been stalked, sexually coerced, emotionally abused, and sexually harassed. My training in Krav Maga physically manifests this truth. Nobody will touch me without my consent. Nobody will hurt me, nobody will rape me, and nobody will make me feel unsafe in my workplace or anywhere else. Knowing how to defend myself gives me that power back, gives me my body back. Krav does all of this for me by strengthening my body and mind to perform in high pressure situations which no longer baffle me, despite my chronic anxiety and depression-induced insecurities. I can't go so far as to say it cures my depression. For me, my treatment is a combined effort of therapy, Krav Maga, medication, a healthy sleep schedule, and support from my family, boyfriend, friends, and coworkers. No one tool is in itself a panacea, but each component is vital to my well-being and success as a person. Krav Maga has aided my recovery and continues to supplement my well-being on a level I can't find anywhere else. The confidence I have built on the mat is unparalleled to anything I've experienced before, and the community brings pure, unprejudiced support that doesn't judge me for who I was before I walked in the door. When it comes to recovering from mental health issues, everybody says that one day the sun comes out, but it's never like that. And nobody who's a responsible adult believes someone or something is going to make everything better. This happens over time with sacrifice, adaptation, hard work, and help. Whatever help means to you, if you choose to seek it, and if it is of any value to you. My depression did not immediately improve after starting the BELT program. In fact, it endured for almost the rest of the year until I progressed into what I guess you could call a remission. Again, though, it didn't start with one great, perfect day. Remission isn't in this respect is cumulative. So I skipped over a small portion where I discussed the struggles I had with getting help from the mental health system, but my situation isn't all that different from anybody else's, and certainly not more traumatic than anyone else's. Presented this way in black and white, it could appear as if my road to remission and eventual recovery is neat and tidy, as if I have all the answers and now live a life free from any mental or emotional struggles. This is not the case. Through trial and error, I eventually collected the tools and strategies I need to get through my mental and emotional challenges every day, and that is working for me. That said, I know it is not so simple for everyone struggling with some form of mental illness. I am a white, straight, cisgender woman. My counselor is a woman and my psychiatrist is a woman. These facts definitely play a role in how seriously I am taken when discussing my mental health. I don't think everyone should seek help in all the same ways that I have, because we all have different challenges and conditions, and we all have different privileges or lack thereof. There is always someone who has it worse than you do, but that basic fact never means that your struggles are less important or less real. I'm infinitely grateful for all of the help that has been provided to me and all of the love and support that has surrounded me for the last year and a half, as in 2018. But my progress doesn't belong to the mental health system or Prozac, it belongs to me. It is something I earned both on and off the mat. Krav is one of the most important aspects of my life now. It has helped me seek my own validation rather than from those around me, and also how to fight back, not just physically, but mentally. I am stronger for what I have been through, and I have the tools to face personal setbacks should they happen again. And if they do next time, I'll have my fists raised, ready to strike. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. So you can see, yeah, I know it's if we were together, we would be clapping and showing our support more physically. And you can see sort of with the Featured Writers Project that hearing Hannah's work and Summer's work demonstrates very different directions in how this can go. We will have writers who identify closely with the mental health system and who have had more positive experiences with it, who might kind of promote a recovery model. And you can sort of hear some of that in Hannah's piece, although Hannah, you did sort of say that your ideas on things, you know, going across the years have sort of changed since you wrote that piece or evolved and since your experience with your brother's death. And you can sort of hear some of Summer's ideas in her poetry But maybe it's a little bit more abstract, but that note from the featured writer really is the place where the writer is able to say, this is how I see myself in the world. This is how I identify with or not with the mental health care system, or in some cases, this is how I've been very much hurt by the mental health care system, or reject these labels that it has placed on me. So I wanted to say that before we transition. I think, Anna, you're going to be our next featured reader.
Hi, yes. So I'm coming in kind of at the last minute, and I'm going to read something that a lot of people here have heard before. The very first part of the memoir I've been writing was reimagining mental health care. And I know Jessica asked that we sort of talk a little bit about our ideas about madness or consciousness or the mental health care. And it's sort of a big, scary thing to sort of come up with in a few minutes, but I realized I really like thinking about these things, and identity is a very it's sort of a topic, a gift that keeps on giving for me, because I never really come to a real understanding of what it is. But I think that identity and consciousness, at least in my experience, are very much linked. So my identity is the lens through which I am conscious, and what I am conscious of affects my identity every second of the day. So I sort of see myself like an onion in a way, with my earliest memories at the center. And I don't really know what the implications of that are, except that I picture myself that way. And I think one of the implications is that my earliest memories are very central to who I am. And I don't know if that's the same for everyone. I've always assumed it is, but that doesn't mean it is. So I'm going to give a content warning for what I'm about to read for a suicide attempt. And it's just the very first page of the memoir I'm writing. And then if there's time, I'll read one poem. Oops, I lost it. Please help me. Please call an ambulance. Standing at the screen door of an unfamiliar bungalow, I shook uncontrollably, vibrating with panic. A young woman answered, a stolid blonde neighbor I didn't know, but had seen out walking with serious purpose, burning up the pavement on short legs. She invited me into her kitchen, looking at me with confusion and concern, but also a certain wary aloofness. Although she might have been a little older than me, she seemed light years ahead in composure and maturity, solid as a rock and just as impenetrable. Sit here, she said, offering me a chair at the table. The room was small, neat, and clean, and strangely for a kitchen, painted a dark oxblood. Her son, less than a year old with fiery red hair, blinked in the sun, streaming in the screen door, and gazed up at me from his baby walker. Although thickly built and clearly his mother's son, his skin was fine and pale, and his fingers tiny and delicate. There was fear on his small face, horror even. Covering my eyes, my mouth, I sobbed, I'm sorry for scaring your baby. In an effort to calm me, the woman hushed, don't worry about the baby. But I caught a whiff of impatience, disdain even. I felt like falling to the floor and wailing. When the ambulance arrived a few minutes later, I walked out the front door past dwindling snowbanks into the bright April sunshine. Wild with misery and completely exposed, I wondered which of the neighbors was peering through their curtains at me as I entered the back of the white van. At that moment, I went from being a free human being with my future spread out before me to a mental patient. Just before I ran from the abandoned gravel pit across the road from my parents' house, I tried to cut my wrist with my dad's utility knife. It barely scratched me because, thanks to my imagination, I was too afraid of pain and what came after death to push the blade deep. But in my psychotic state, when I looked at my wrist, I was convinced I would bleed to death on the inside. The image of myself filling up with blood to my eyeballs, bruising a deep purple all over, was too much for me. Dropping the utility knife beside a bottle of Australian sherry from my parents' liquor cabinet, I ran from the scrub brush through the gravel pit to the first house in my path. Months later, when I was discharged from the mental hospital, still irreparably wounded and bleeding in a way no one could see, I gathered my courage and knocked on the door of the same house with lilacs of thanks and apology in my hand. The young woman who had helped me opened the door and took them, said thank you, and closed the door in my face. I stood there a moment, then turned and left. I didn't have the chance to explain. So that's the first page of my memoir that I'm hoping to combine with a lot of poems that I've already written and will write more of. And this one is called Medication Time. Somewhere there is a great hole where all our happiness is buried. We walk the streets in cloaks of fog, puddle-soaked and dreamless. Our umbrella closes weakly over us, a broken thing. We look for the sun's ragged spot in the sky, but it's endless, cloud upon cloud. Inside us is a tap turned off, the dark drip into a tin can, that's all. There's nothing to be done but get in line and wait for the latest dispensation. Little circles, ovals, oblongs, bitter as dandelions.
Thank you so much, Anna. So Anna joined us. Anna is going to be one of MIDA's featured writers in the coming year. And so we don't know if this will be the piece that Anna will publish, and Anna certainly will write a new statement from the writer. But again, the piece that Anna shared first, some of us in this room have seen, because we've been working on it through the Herstory workshop, Memoirs to Reimagine Mental Health Care, where we've been using sort of the Herstory method to build memoirs that are going to impact stranger readers, that are going to dare readers to care and try to sort of reshape the system. And we've been working on that a lot. So thank you so much for being here today, Anna, and sharing. And our last reader today is Nicole.
Hello. Okay, so I'm just going to briefly share part of my writer's statement because other parts of it are kind of like sprinkled throughout my reading. Okay. I consider myself a mad woman. My research centers on social justice movements and literature, particularly regarding how larger social structures and systems, such as neoliberalism, the patriarchy, and racism, negatively impact women and minorities. Aligning with MIDA's mission, I strive to rise up against institutional injustices as an activist, educator, and writer. I seek to uncover female voices that have been ignored or silenced due to patriarchal systems and Western male-based ideologies. So my piece was published last year in 2020, and it was titled My Story from Darkness to Light. I divided this piece into 4 sections. The first painfully detailed my first panic attack, which I'm not going to read today, but feel free to read it on the website. The second shares my negative experiences with our healthcare industry. The third expresses my gratitude towards having a positive experience with therapy. And then the final section is more forward-looking as I push back against social stigmas about mental health and madness. Overall, my piece is an attempt to share my experience with severe digestive issues and anxiety, as well as to shed light on my attempt to achieve corporeal self-love with the hope of inspiring others to do the same and to share their stories. So I'm going to share a few excerpts from my piece with some conversational interludes as I reflect a bit on what I wrote. You're bulimic. You're anorexic. You're making this up for attention. Your pain is all in your head. You should just go on antidepressants. These were the blaming the victim responses I received from doctors growing up because of my digestive issues. They were frustrated. I was frustrated. I was born prematurely, a forced birth, because the doctors thought there was a hole in my heart. Spoiler alert, they were wrong. From the beginning, I had an underdeveloped nervous system, and I cried nonstop for the first 6 months of my life. I was angry. At the ripe age of 12, I was diagnosed with IBS and GERD. I had and still have frequent stomach pain and discomfort, often so bad that sometimes it is just easier to not eat. But all of the probing and testing to figure out what was wrong with me only led to more questions. I felt left in the dark, and I grew to develop a negative relationship with my body. As I started to lose faith in Western medicine and do my own research, something became vehemently more clear. My stomach and my mind are one. If I'm feeling anxious, say before a big test or a talk, I get sick to my stomach. If I get sick to my stomach from something I ate, I feel anxious. I now know this as the brain-gut connection, but it took setting aside my beliefs in Western medicine to begin understanding the crucial link between my physical body and my mental health. My journey toward healing my gut and understanding the mind-body connection hit a major challenge last year, now 2 years ago, when my house was burglarized and I lost the majority of my belongings. My nervous system went into overdrive. I developed PTSD that manifested itself through insomnia, nightmares, and blood pressure fluctuations, as my brain signaled to my physical body that I was in danger of dying. When my normal approaches to calming my nervous system proved useless, I reached out for help at my university's counseling center. What surprised me most, though, was the socially ingrained stigmas I had against therapy. And just like my first panic attack, I did not want anyone to know what was going on. The deepest fear undergirding my journey has been the fear of stigma. More specifically, the fear of how others will judge me if I share my story. This fear is rooted in learned social stigmas, as well as my family's history of privacy about mental illness. Specifically, I grew up knowing that I had a great-grandmother, Rita, who was institutionalized and diagnosed with schizophrenia. Throughout my adolescence, I feared that I too would develop schizophrenia because it may be genetically passed down. And just as an aside, this was something I worried about frequently growing up, especially when I was feeling anxious, because schizophrenia is one of those things that they haven't found clear genetic markers, I don't believe, even though it's shown to kind of reoccur in families. So this is something I brought up to my therapist a year or so ago. Okay, my therapist reminded me that medicine has advanced significantly since Rita's time, and it is possible that schizophrenia was not even the correct diagnosis. But this conversation has got me searching for Rita, longing to know her story. I have learned that she died in her early 50s and underwent electric shock therapy, as well as spent time in a straitjacket while institutionalized. My heart swells every time I picture this, a woman crying in pain, experiencing delusions and hallucinations, and unable to break free of the stigma-induced restraints that labeled her crazy. I cannot help but wonder what her story is. How did she perceive reality? Would therapy, lifestyle, and diet changes have helped her? What memories about her are being silenced because she had mental illness? So I want to take a moment and reflect on my piece a little bit, because it was originally supposed to be more about Rita and sharing her story. However, I ran into a lot of challenges because my family has been very hush-hush about Rita. When I interviewed my grandparents, my aunts, my mother, they all had varying and fragmented stories about her. In fact, they all even had different information about how she died. One said it was a blood clot, another said it was a blood clot from being in a straitjacket, and then another person said it was something closer to like liver failure. So just kind of all over the place. And my experience trying to learn Rita's mental health story, I think, speaks to some of the challenges with establishing a MAD archive. So in particular, I think we as MAD archivists need to consider if and why we should share our stories or our ancestors' stories. I firmly believe that sharing our personal mental health stories is part of the healing process, and it can help break down social stigmas about madness, as well as challenge definitions of normal behaviors. I also think it's highly important for our stories not to be silenced or ignored, but I do wonder about privacy or permissions when it comes to sharing our ancestors' stories. Because my family is so private, am I dishonoring them by speaking about Rita? Or do I have the right to investigate, know, and share her story because it's also my story as her great-granddaughter? Keeping her story silent feels like we're trying to ignore her experience and even existence, but I also acknowledge that her illness caused significant trauma for some of my family members. And I think these generational traumas are also part of her story. Still, we need to be careful of how we are interpreting and collecting archival materials, as this process is not objective. Archivist Michelle Caswell has warned against erasing or dehumanizing people through the process of cataloging and documenting. So we need to be careful of our archival approach and make sure to honor the people whose lives and experiences we are including. Even though I know little about Rita and it's all just fragments and just disjointed memories from my family members, aren't most archival artifacts fragments and subjective glimpses of some lived experience? History, after all, is a version of the truth. What I think a MAD archive can offer then is a chance to share the MAD community's version of the truth, sharing our stories and experiences with the mental health industry, mental illness, and social stigmas and judgment will open up new avenues for conversation and interrogation about oppressive social systems of control. So to quote my concluding statement from my featured writer piece, we must challenge those who speak for us. We must spread awareness about our struggles with the mental health industry by sharing our stories. So I ask you, what is your story? Will you be brave enough to share it? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Nicole. Actually, this is, it just ended up that you're the last one to speak, but what you just said sort of segues really well into a discussion. So I think I have a list of questions, but I think that we'll just kind of go with where you were leading here. And I want to also say that it was Nicole. So I met Nicole at an academic conference, not related to MAD studies, madness, nothing like that. But we ended up getting to know each other, and during a walk, you told me about your grandmother. And I remember all of a sudden, I think I said to you, oh, wow, this has opened up so many thoughts and ideas for me, hearing your experience, because I also had been told about, after my institutionalization, I learned after that, that both of my Irish great-grandparents, my grandfather's parents were both institutionalized in mental asylums in Buffalo after immigrating here, and different asylums. And so my grandfather was an orphan, and no one has ever mentioned why he was an orphan, and we never knew why. And then I found out that they were both institutionalized. Now, we don't have any records. In fact, the asylum that my great-great-grandmother was in no longer exists. So, this also has made me think about the disappearing archive of our lives, the disappearing archive of those who have been harmed and institutionalized or held in attics of families and sort of like suppressed up there. That's a disappearing archive. And then you raise these other issues about the ethics of sharing the stories of those that are passed down to us through oral traditions, through our living relatives who share the fragments, but then also want to suppress them because of how highly stigmatized it is. And I want to open this up for conversation. It's sort of what Nicole raised, because I do plan to write about my grandmother Rose in some way. And Madwomen in the Attic is starting, we've wanted to lead this project called the Elders Project, where people write about trying to connect with elders who have been harmed by stigma attached to mental illness, or, the kind of interweaving of racism and stigma and all that kind of thing. But to do it in a way where it's your process, the writer is sort of seeking information. I know Summer was going to write for this project. We haven't really launched the project yet, but maybe because of these ethical issues, it's good for us to sort of think through, because that will be a kind of archive where their stories are living through us in the way that we convey them. And so how we convey them and how we archive them is very important. So if anyone wants to just share your thoughts, it can be in response to anything, because more generally, but it's specifically in relation to our elders and sort of the fragments of their stories interweaving with ours. Please do. Yeah, we'll start with Summer.
So recently I wanted to speak about my Irish maternal ancestry, one of which would be my grandmother on my mother's side, and she was institutionalized at 14 in St. Louis at a Catholic girls' home, and one of her first children was actually sold against her faculties. She was just too young, and they just took it upon themselves to do that. And she saw her child being taken into custody by another, like a couple that was considered to be, I guess, better suited for the child. So she had named her, and I wrote this poem, but I wanted to be able to ingrain that and to be able to capitalize on my understanding of just speaking from my eyes, but genetically encrypted her story through me. And so that was the initialized response that I had with intergenerational trauma. And so just recently, I had fourth institutionalization in February of this last year. And it was after I got trained in intergenerational trauma therapy. And so that was in January. I was focusing on Native American realities that have happened, and it just was impactful. And I am looking forward to being able to just regurgitate the response on a just a basic human level. And I want to be able to be a part of that as I'm on the other end of the response that I've just recently had mental health wise. So I look forward to that. I'm glad that other people are able to see the traumas of their ancestry and go and process through that. And I'm excited that the US is kind of focusing on that with the Native American disparities. So that's something I think that as a nation, we're getting ready to start doing, and we're cultivating the soil and the opportunities for that. And it's going to be very painful collectively. And it's a consciousness that I think we're all going in a directive towards.
Thank you, Summer. Others want to share in response to this or something else? Anna,
Yeah.
yeah.
I always have a bit of trepidation when it comes to telling other people's stories, especially telling them in their voice or like imagining their voice. But so it's a really interesting question, but my tendency would be to think, okay, just don't do it. But maybe like to stick with what we know. But I know that's fraught with many issues too. So but anyway, that's my concern always, is telling other people's stories. I feel
Yeah.
my limit is to tell a story that I know from my inside out, and to try to leave the other stories to other people. Maybe that's a cop out though. I don't know.
Yeah, and I mean, writers have dealt with this by writing fiction and we're sort of telling their ancestral intergenerational traumas through fiction. But I think that this raises a lot of issues. What you said, Anna, it seriously is a concern. And Summer, what you said is very important as well. I tend to, when I think about the mental health care system and what we are calling the mental health care system, the asylums that really were places of colonial violence, of patriarchal violence, of racist violence, when we're thinking about the histories of these places, histories of our relatives, maybe of those we're connected with, are already embedded in those places. They are embedded in the medical documents and in the court documents already there. So our stories are already being told about our relatives who have been harmed or institutionalized. And are they the stories we really want, set in permanence? And that's where I start to feel a little bit of a sense of thinking about my grandmother. Oh, those medical documents that said she was this or that. I can't grasp her. I can't find her either, but that's not what I want to be the only thing that's said about this relative. And I think there are creative ways to explore connecting with our ancestors and learning about them where we're not telling someone else's story per se. But I see that I'm going to go to Betty and then to Hannah because I see some hands raised.
Yeah, Hannah was first, and it's noisy here right now.
Okay, all right, Hannah.
I can, you wanted me to go ahead first?
I guess, yeah, she wants you to go ahead.
Okay, sure. So this is on the line of, yeah, it's on the same topic, but it's slightly different. But in terms of telling intergenerational stories of trauma, when my brother passed, my brother was an extremely creative person, and he wrote a lot, and he created a lot, and he filmed a lot, and he was a filmmaker. And so he had all of this creative work that was collected after he passed. And so there's still kind of a bit of a controversy around whether or not that should be shared. It was stuff that he chose not to share. So that's sort of what it reminded me of, and where I kind of am at in terms of telling the stories of our ancestors and in these situations is trying to tell it as tell as our story, like what is our story in relation to what has happened. So rather than necessarily, giving, just giving a history from their perspective, giving our perspective on that history and how it relates to what's going on now, because it's often not that different from what's happening right now. So I think it's really important to tell those stories because they're not that different from what's happening right now. But I understand that it can be a violation. Like in terms of my brother did not have a lot of interactions with the mental health system, but my brother would feel very violated by a breach of privacy in terms of sharing his work and sharing his stories. But I try to tell my brother's story from my perspective and what my relationship was to him. So
Yeah.
that's kind of where I stand with it.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And I think this is also a great reminder for all of us to determine what we want with our writing. As writers, what do we want happening with our documents? For me, I want everything published that I ever had. The medical documents, the writing, and I've written my own, informal will that states, please put this all out there. I want everything out in the world. But if you don't have that, yeah, we do run into some ethical issues. Betty, can you join us and share now?
Yeah, I am outside, so hopefully a motorcycle won't go by. So the interesting thing for me sitting in this room is I am an elder. So it's interesting to come to that. I'm 66. And I have been hospitalized many, many times since I was 24. My family has always been ashamed of, in fact, my extended family thinks that I'm like the most well-traveled person because when I couldn't go to birthday parties, I was hiking through France. And when I couldn't attend graduations and weddings, I was on a train in Europe. I mean, I just have been all over the world when really I was probably in a quiet room somewhere. I've also had the experience of really none of my family coming to visit me because, well, most of them didn't know I was there. And the ones who did, like my sisters, just didn't. And I don't know if they were told not to, but anyway, the thing that I'm wanting to get at is shame. Are we not telling our ancestors' stories because of the shame of our parents or the shame that our parents knew that their parents felt, even though everybody's gone now? Does shame live past your life?
Yes.
At what point, I guess to me, Hannah, when you talk about your brother, it feels different to me if the people we're talking about are no longer alive, but also people who were very close to them are also no longer alive. I found letters from a great aunt that she had written to another great person, and they got passed down, and I now own them. And there are stories about her being in a sanitarium. And my mother and I were reading them together, and we were like, wow, I didn't know. In fact, it was actually just a great aunt. But with my history, it's like, wow, I didn't know that I had a family member who had spent years in a sanitarium. Come to find out, the very last paragraph of all these letters was she had TB. So I think it's also important that we don't assume what's going on, especially knowing, I have epilepsy, and I know that people used to be hospitalized for life with epilepsy. So I would hate for people to say that there's shame in epilepsy. You know, if that was really their diagnosis and that's why they were put in a mental hospital, let's not pass on the fact that there's shame about her being there when really she just had epilepsy. So do we let our family's shame of where she ended up, regardless of why she was there, form the story of our lives? The other part for this is as an elder who hasn't written really anything about my life, but think about my nieces and nephews and think about their children who are now, you know, coming up to 10 years old, my sister's grandchildren. Do they have a right to know that I'm bipolar? You know, because it can be passed on, and you know, people can start having symptoms that nobody knows to think about because they haven't, you know, my niece didn't tell her daughter's doctor that her great aunt was, you know, live with bipolar. So how much of that is my responsibility as an alive elder to make sure that people do know my stories? And so how much of that comes in when we talk about sharing stories of people who have passed away that our family members need to know, like you were talking about with schizophrenia. You know, if it can be passed down, then my nieces and nephews have a right to know. It's not even about my embarrassment, my shame. It's about their rights, I think. And so I've been thinking about that as everybody has been talking. And it's interesting to try and balance the shame and stigma and not pass that on, but to think about the rights of the future generations, especially, well, even with epilepsy, that, you know, my sister and I both have epilepsy, you know. So one other thing I want to say really quickly is because I was traveling in France and England and Ireland and everywhere, my cousins didn't know what I was going through. And I was forbidden, like told with the word forbidden, to tell anybody in the family about anything that I had lived through. And I decided to write a book about suicide. And I decided to bring it to a family reunion. And I decided to put it on the table and tell my cousins to go read it. And this was without my parents' permission, although they had read the book and said they loved it and that I should publish it. And it was like, this is interesting. So my cousins, I sat there and watched my cousins read it. And a second cousin turned to me and she goes, "Oh, Betty, I wish I had known. I went through this with my son. We went through so many attempted suicides with him. I wish I had known I could have come to you and talked to you about it."
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Betty,
You
for
know,
sharing all that.
yeah, we carry so much shame from other people.
Yeah, no, it's a really important part that you were saying about the shame, and you raised many important points. And I think that this also reveals to me just how much we don't share the same ideas about everything. Like everything we're discussing today, we all have our own kind of versions of things and disagreements, like schizophrenia as a label. Like hearing Nicole talk about a grandmother being labeled as schizophrenic is bothersome to me because that label is a label that I have trouble with, that I've read the history of. So to sort of carry on that label and place it on your grandmother in any way feels so like, oh, but even just hearing the label, like you had received some information about it. And instead of maybe being like, oh, this is something I want, you know, I'm glad I know about, it created such anxiety for you, like living in fear because the stigma was so strong. But I also just want to open this up. We don't have a lot of time left. And the thing about with thinking about historical documents and medical documents, like our lives are already archived. If you are in the medical system, your life is, you're in the psychiatric system in some way. There's an archive, and if you can get your medical document and see what it truly looks like, you might not be very happy with how you're going to be preserved in court documents or in medical documents after you're gone. Now, getting access to medical documents, say for a relative or something like that who was in an asylum, there are a lot of rules, and the privacy rules of hospitals also serve a dual function. And one of them is to sort of protect the institution from criticism, and protect how it's operating from criticism. So they have like laws like 40 or 50 years after a death until anyone can sort of access the file unless someone has made those wishes known. So there's the matter of the Matt Archive in looking to the past. And then there's us living in the present and what we can do to sort of create our own archive that pushes back against us. And that's sort of what this presentation and what this gathering is really about. And it does lead us. It leads us to thinking about ancestry and intergenerational trauma, because we are living out those legacies of different forms of intergenerational trauma. And so how we form our archive is part of that. I know Bonnie, did you want to share anything? You have so much information about what kind of archival work has been done around madness. So I wanted to give you the
Yeah.
floor here for a couple of
Well,
minutes.
more about the system and treatment than about individual experience. In the last maybe 5 years, university people and activists have become sort of panicked, I'll say, because the people in their 60s and 70s who created programs in the 80s and 90s are dying, and they're taking their relatives throw away all their material. So there's a university in Canada and one at Temple University who are collecting all the newsletters, the signs that said housing, not Haldol, the big hypodermic needles that were used in demonstrations, and respite centers that were created, Soteria House, which didn't have any medicine, but you could go stay there if you had lots of money. Drop-in centers, the beginning of peer support, but it's all program things, and it's protest stuff, particularly against ECT. They are not collecting poetry and art that people have done over those periods. So, and they're doing it so graduate students can come in and look at the material and write a history. I'd like to see not only the poetry of this group somewhere, but there are all these collections of poetry people have written, and nobody has gathered them as the voices of mental health. I call ourselves psychiatric survivors. I don't know where it could be. I mean, you can put stuff online, but it would be hard to put a book online that's already published. It would really have to be a library where the librarian cared about the subject.
Yes.
And was willing to keep it. And then it's permanent, it's protected from fire and vandalism, and it's there for the future.
Yes, and another thing, so an archive can be created through a librarian who sort of takes it on as a project, or through an institution that says, oh, we want this writer, usually it's a famous writer, something like this, we want their documents to be preserved. Again, that's a whole topic, the archives and the literary figures and different
Well,
figures.
past stuff that's already published, like Anna's poetry, that could be archived. And then
Absolutely.
what you're doing would probably go into some kind of format. It might be online because it's more modern.
Well, I mean, that was the whole question, is I want to see it in a physical space. And I was thinking about the example of I'm teaching a course this semester where we are working with the archives at Buffalo State College.
Mhm.
And Madeline Davis, who's a well-known lesbian activist figure here in Buffalo, New York, when she died, she had been a librarian. And her life's work
Ooh.
was to create the LGBTQ archive of Western New York. And she had, hundreds of boxes here, of materials that of the things that she lived through. She started gathering this, and this was 30 years of work to gather it. And then when she passed on, that now became, she probably left maybe some money to create the archive, but it's now housed in the library. So I've been thinking about Madwomen in the Attic and what we might do to start now creating a space for people to start collecting it, like getting boxes in a room in my house, and to say, if you're a mad person who survived something and you want to be part of this archive that we're building, we're going to put it here. Now, having it at my house, I'm not sure that seems like the right way to go, but I don't know where else to do it. And so I'm just learning, and I want something to be done that is tangible and physical, and that is associated with a place like a library that will have longevity after I'm gone, after we're gone.
But long-term libraries won't have paper.
Well, I'm choosing to be
I mean,
not.
I like paper, but there won't be paper. There'll be books like Kindle things that'll.
I hope that's not true, but we'll, oh God. That's a whole other thing. So we're out of our time for the official time, but I'm just going to leave this space open. If anyone who didn't get to kind of chime in wants to, we didn't really get to a lot of our discussion questions. I'm going to leave them there because this is ongoing, but I think it was still powerful what we were able to talk about. But if anyone wants to stay and continue talking or share something before you go, I'll be here. So yeah, Dr. West.
Thank you all for sharing that with me. Thank you, Jessica, for inviting me. It's just a little tag for what I get Bonnie said. I think if we start to have conversations in unlikely places about the archiving, because I found like I've been trying to archive some of Katie Cannon's, Reverend Dr. Katie Cannon stuff, and there is a place for that. But it took a while for me to connect to the right person, even though I'm in that network. But I had this thought when Bonnie was talking that we could even be talking to a friend and mention it. And, a friend knows 10 other people who knows 10 other people.
That's right.
Because I don't think that a traditional method will really help us with that. And the other piece was what Bonnie was so right on point with, is we won't be dealing with paper. And I mean, I saw that at Western, I saw that at Florida International University. And one of the things is the librarians, well, the administrative portion of the school, the financial end of these schools, they can't afford to keep up with all the digital stuff. And so they've gotten rid of some of the journals. And so you might have to I have to go to Emory to get anything here because other schools can't afford to keep up with that. And Emory is decreasing the amount of paper they have, and they have like a foundation. It's really, so I think that that too. I don't know how to answer Bonnie's question, but I'm just trying to throw out that, because I think we have to think of unlikely places, or maybe one day, sometimes I run into people who I didn't know at the time, but they had a lot of money and they're interested in these things, and then they can, and so I'm becoming a little more vocal with saying things that may be needed, not for me in particular, but for a community, particularly around women and religion and ethnicity. For me, is my place, the place I've chosen. But I think that that's something that I haven't done enough of, and I've underestimated what people's capacities are because I never even mentioned it. So I don't want to talk any longer, but thank you all again. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you so
Love
much.
you big time.
So good to see you. And I think you're right about thinking about, that was one of the aspects of this, is a man archive is already kind of an unlikely thing. It's unlikely to be kept. If I think about different archives and different forms, you're taking like the stories of people, if we think about going back, people that they've been destroyed by systems, and their stories have been destroyed by the system. And the records that only exist are the kind of colonizing, racist, patriarchal, harmful records. That is all that's the fragment that's left. So I think that it's just a call. This is kind of ending our session. It's like we're part of this, answering this call for what we can do with our voices, our lives, our stories at this time. And this is an ongoing conversation. So if we, if you have other ideas or thoughts for Madwomen in the Attic and what we can do as an organization to try to preserve, because we have a website, but I pay for it a yearly fee to keep it. So me being alive is really necessary in order for that website to be existing and for our archive to exist. And I wrote in my little fake will of my, my informal will for myself, what I want to happen with that. I leave it to my sister as long as she's alive, and then what's going to happen. But there needs to be money, to have a website that lasts a long time. You need money and you can't insure it. So it's so complicated. But thank you all for being here today. I will stay for a couple of minutes if anyone wants to just talk with me, but I think I'm going to end the recorded part of the session. I so appreciate all of you being here and being part of this conversation. Thank you.
Namaste. Wow.
Okay.
Jessica, this is really something.